I'm Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climatographers. We all bring assumptions to our decision-making, and experts emphasize that we should regularly reevaluate those assumptions to protect against traps like confirmation bias. Our assumption audits help you do just that by taking advantage of the thousands of hours of knowledge curation we've organized in the Climate Web. You can learn more at the conclusion of this assumption audit. So let's jump in. The debate over fossil fuel subsidies has been around for a long time, and the numbers that get thrown around can be pretty confusing. In this assumptions audit, we're going to try and clarify the situation. We'll be working with some of the contents from this fossil fuel subsidies dashboard in the Climate Web, which points you as well to larger libraries of sources up here, as well as news and opinion pieces that you can dig into if you want to dig deeper. There's been a lot of discussion of a report that came out last year from the International Monetary Fund, calculating that fossil fuel subsidies amount to $5.9 trillion per year. That is a lot of money. And the reason this matters is that countries agreed almost 15 years ago to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. But what is it that we're supposed to be phasing out of? In the case of the US, for example, are we supposed to phase out of 4.6, 27.4, or $649 billion worth of subsidies? As you can infer from this headline, it's probably more than a question of what source to use. It's a question of what's meant by the word subsidy. For most of us, the idea of energy subsidies probably suggests that money is being directly or indirectly transferred to energy companies. But that's not necessarily the case. So now let's focus on that IMF report that came out last year. As you can see, we've gone through the report to extract some key graphics and ideas, and I'm going to expand the notes field side of the screen to show some of them to you. This is the single graphic that most clearly lays out what is going on in the report in arriving at its estimate of $5.9 trillion of subsidies in 2020. Note the gray shading here on the diagram. These are so-called explicit subsidies. In other words, money going from the government to fossil fuel companies, either directly or via provisions of the tax code or some other means. But they are explicit. They are subsidies intended to support energy production or to make it cheaper to consume energy, that kind of thing. You can see, however, that that number, even globally, is only about $500 billion, which is a far cry from $6 trillion. The other 5.3 or 5.4 trillion are what's called implicit subsidies. And here we can get a good sense of what those implicit subsidies are and why there's so much confusion about the term subsidy. You can see that the costs of local air pollution are in here and that it's a very large part of the overall subsidies picture. You can see that the costs of climate change are in here. It's a quite significant part of the overall picture, 30% roughly. And there are also some costs associated with things like road congestion. So those are in here as part of the fossil fuel subsidy calculation. In other words, a lot of what we're talking about here as subsidies is what is more commonly talked about as an externality rather than as a subsidy. And I'm not quite sure why the IMF wants to call them subsidies. Other international organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, talk about this topic in a very different way. I know that the IMF's goal of giving policymakers the information they need to understand the real economics of our current energy system is a good one, but I'm still not sure why they wouldn't have used the term externality or unpriced costs rather than implicit subsidy. In digging a bit deeper into some of these numbers, local air pollution accounts for more than 40% of the total subsidy number. So it's worth noting that its derivation is a bit arbitrary and definitely contentious in how it values a life in a richer versus a poorer country. In other words, this number, depending on the methodology, could change quite a bit. Similarly, the costs of climate change or global warming are estimated to be about 30% of the total subsidy. The study here uses $60 per ton of CO2 equivalent in 2020. And they use that number as the carbon price that they estimate would be required to get us to a 2 degrees centigrade target. Now, that's quite a low estimate for what it would take to get us to a 2-degree target. And estimates of the social cost of carbon, which is supposed to measure the economic damages of climate change, range far higher. So the headline that we started out with could just as easily have concluded that fossil fuel subsidies total $10 trillion or even $15 trillion, even while the explicit subsidy number of $500 billion would remain unchanged. The bottom line of this report is that fossil fuel prices are far too low across most of the world when you account for the air pollution costs associated with them, the climate change costs associated with them, and some other variables, including some of the transportation sector costs, and that the world would be economically better off if fossil fuels were priced at the 100% level in this graphic. And you can see that coal, for example, none of the coal in the world is priced at the 100% level, and most of the coal being burned in the world is priced at only 20% of the level that the study says would be efficient. In other words, the study suggests that energy prices ought to be much higher. The main takeaway here is that when you see a headline like this, you have to start by asking what's meant by the word subsidy. When it comes to anything to do with the economics of climate change, the devil is likely to be in the details. And of course, it's not just about fossil fuel subsidies. It's something that you want to pay close attention to no matter what the topic being discussed. Numbers can be sliced and diced in all kinds of ways when it comes to these headlines. And so, as I already noted, anytime you're dealing with economic analysis around climate change, remember that the devil is in the details. I hope you found our video useful. We've dedicated more than 25,000 hours to building the climate web as a collective intelligence for accelerating climate progress. Climate change is a wicked problem, and the climate web is unique in its coverage of the many topics relevant to understanding climate risks and to making climate progress. The climate web is freely available online, but if you're seriously concerned about or working on climate change, download it for much faster and more powerful access. Or jumpstart your own knowledge management system with topical slices of the climate web or even a copy of the entire thing. Contact us to see how our 30+ years in this field, in combination with the climate web, can advance your climate goals. Use the Linktree link below for more information and check out a couple of our user testimonials. Thanks for watching, and remember that the clock is ticking on climate risk.